Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is George Wuerthner. He's a former Ecological Projects Director for the Foundation for Deep Ecology. He's an ecologist and wildlands activist. He's published 38 books on environmental issues and natural history, including such environmentally focused books as Welfare Ranching, Wildfire, Thrillcraft, Energy, and most recently Protecting the Wild. Today we talk about the need to expand the national parks. So, as always, thank you for your just decades of incredible work, and also thank you for being on the program.
Well, thank you for having me, Derek.
So how about if we start by talking about what national parks are? Just presume maybe somebody's living in New York City, you know, they think of a park and they think of Central Park. So first off, what's a national park and what are their history?
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to start. The national parks the whole idea of national parks began in the United States in 1872 when Yellowstone National Park was established. And the original purpose of the park was to withdraw it from what was then the Manifest Destiny philosophy of the country. I mean, actually, it's pretty remarkable in 1872, just after the Civil War, that any public land or territory would be withdrawn from exploitation. In other words, grazing, logging, mining, etc. The West was being settled at that time, and the emphasis of the federal government was to encourage that kind of development, and they passed all sorts of laws to encourage that development. For example, the Homestead Act, the Mining Law of 1872, the Timber and Stone Act. All these were various laws that helped to help people get a hold of unclaimed federal territory and basically make it their own and exploit it.
Wait. But before we go any further, I just want to mention that when we think of the Homestead Act, we generally think of, you know, individuals coming out and being an individual person who is perhaps an immigrant who has a terrible life, who's going to make their life better. But the truth is that all those laws were incredibly corrupt and were used by corporations for massive land grabs. So I just wanted to put that in as an asterisk.
Well, definitely, particularly more so like the Timber and Stone Act. This is a diversion, but it was very common for timber companies to say to their employees, we want you to claim some land under the Timber and Stone Act, and we'll, you know, buy you some whiskey in the bar and pay you $50 if you'll turn it over to us. And that, for example, is how a lot of the redwood country in California was privatized, was through such fraudulent methods like that. So anyway, that was you know, and the government basically turned a blind eye to a lot of that because it was still consistent with the overall philosophy of getting these lands into private hands for development. So Yellowstone was the exception. And the reason is because Yellowstone has the world's greatest collection of hot springs and thermal features, and that was the original idea, was to protect things like Old Faithful. But interestingly, and this will probably be a theme I'll come back to later, what we realize now, that one of the great benefits of Yellowstone is that it also protects wildlife habitat, which back in 1872, you know, the entire West was pretty much unfragmented wildlife habitat, and nobody would have seen a reason for protecting land for wildlife. But as history has progressed and a lot of that land was developed, now a place like Yellowstone is an island of intact habitat that isn't available in a lot of other places. Anyway, the Yellowstone was the first one, and then Yosemite was set aside in 1890, and Sequoia National Park in 1890, and in a rapid succession after that, a number of other iconic parks that we all know, like Glacier, Mount Rainier, Crater Lake, and so forth, were designated. And initially, most of these parks were designated because they were the spectacular landscapes. Anybody who's been to the Yosemite Valley or seen Crater Lake knows what I'm talking about. And the sort of the goal of it was to set aside the most beautiful and scenic parts of America, and to in some ways, some people say it was an attempt to rival Europe's cathedrals and urban kinds of landscapes by saying, well, America has these spectacular landscapes that rival anything that you can find in the world, which they do. And so the national parks got established initially for that. And then over the years, we have tucked into the national parks agency their management of other aspects of America's history and culture, so that a lot of the national park units, and I say units because you have national parks, which is a specific kind of unit within the National Park Service. So we have national historic sites, national seashores, national recreation areas, and so forth that are managed now under the Park Service. So you have things like you might have a national battlefield like Gettysburg, which tells the story of the Civil War. You might have a cultural site like Martin Luther King's home, which would tell a little bit about Martin Luther King and the racial divide that occurred in the country and his efforts to end it. So the Park Service now manages many different kinds of sites across the country that tell basically the nation's story. And so that's been their expanded role. But nevertheless, what it's still best known for are these iconic landscape scale type of parks. And they're managed differently from other public land. And this is an important point. We have also other public lands like national forests. We have Bureau of Land Management lands. We have national wildlife refuges. But a lot of the activities that are allowed on these other public lands are prohibited in national parks. So, for example, you can shoot wolves on national forest land, but you can't in a national park. You can cut logs on national forest land, but you can't log in a national park. You can, graze cattle on Bureau of Land Management lands or in a wildlife refuge, but with a few exceptions that I could mention, you can't do that in national parks. So the national parks are in many ways, are lands that are managed most for ecosystem integrity, and the emphasis is on protecting the native wildlife and native ecosystems as opposed to allowing commercial exploitation, mining or drilling for oil or logging or cattle grazing, etc. How's that?
That's great. And so let's talk for a moment, before we talk about the need to expand the national parks, let's talk about threats to... Actually, there's a different direction I want to go first, which is,
okay. Several
years ago, some very smart activists came through who are bioregionalists, and they were talking about the importance of local autonomy. And they gave a wonderful presentation. And afterwards, and I live in Del Norte County in Northern California, which is like 90% federal. The county is mainly owned by the government. It's national park, redwoods, and also state park, and then some national forest. And the point is that there were people in the audience, environmentalists in the audience, who loved what the bioregionalists had to say, except then they said, it's great that we have local autonomy, but if there were really local autonomy here in Del Norte County, there wouldn't be a redwood standing. That the parks have been absolutely crucial. The fact that these are parklands are what prevented people from cutting all these trees. And so I wanted to say that just in terms of the importance of these national parks. If it weren't for the national parks, there would be none of these redwoods standing. That's one thing I wanted to say. And another thing I wanted to say is it's always an interesting sort of dichotomy that we do want local control on one level, but on the other hand, when it comes to places like this, I call Del Norte County Mississippi on the North Coast. if it comes to places like this, you actually need federal control because the locals would cut down everything. I don't know what point I'm getting to, but if there's anything you want to say about that, that's great.
Well, I actually totally agree with you, and what you see around the country, but is that generally local economies take precedence over long-term protection of the land and future generations' rights, you might say, to inherit and experience the landscape that the locals want to eliminate right now. And that that whole thing about local control, which is, of course, was the center part of the Bundy gang try to take over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge and Cliven Bundy's illegal grazing of cattle down in southern Nevada and so forth. These are examples of what you would have probably with the local control of these resources and these lands. And so I tend to want to see the most democratic, which means democratic control by the greatest, broadest representation of people, because that tends to mute the call for exploitation immediately. But it's important to point out that, this whole movement towards rural control of federal lands is growing in some ways across the West right now, and in a lot of ways, I think unfortunately it's sometimes supported by people in urban areas that buy into the idea, well, they're the locals, so they must know best how to manage these lands, and in fact, the idea of management is often means commercial exploitation. So it's not necessarily that you understand anything about ecology, or you're thinking about future generations, or thinking about the animals that are out there in the landscape at all.
So before we get to the notion of expanding the national parks, which both you and I would think would be wonderful, let's talk about some of the threats to the national parks. There are, locally here, there have been calls for a long time to privatize the national parks, to sell off the lands. This is not just a bunch of local people who want to make money off of it. This has some traction in Congress as well. Can you talk about some of the threats to the national parks?
Oh yeah, they're particularly Representative Bishop in Utah is leading the charge on this to try to disenfranchise Americans in general of their public lands, including national parks. And that effort has a number of really sort of like Tea Party type congressmen and senators that are in the U.S. federal government right now, and their argument is that privatization would wind up managing the land more efficiently, and they have some, conservative economic, what do you call them, sort of foundations that advocate that and presumably present evidence to that effect. But usually what you see in these economic assessments that say that private industry could do a better job is that they basically ignore externalities in their accounting. So, for example, what happens to the watersheds that are polluted because of sediment from logging roads? What happens to wildlife that's sensitive from and are displaced by that activity? So that's the problem with a lot of that privatization talk, is that it often doesn't have a complete accounting of the cost, which the federal government by law is supposed to do. Now, we can argue that they don't do as good a job as they should. I would be the first to admit that. But they still are better at it than private companies in general.
So are the threats to privatize the national parks or sell them off? Let's just use the real language, to sell them off to corporations. Are those threats sort of way out there and something we don't need to really worry about, or do those threats have enough traction that that this is something that needs to be that we need to drop the other things we're doing, from our very busy schedules and pick up that one because it would be dreadful if it happened? Is this a credible threat? Is the question.
I think it is a credible threat, but it wouldn't come the way that you just described it, because of course it would be a Trojan horse thing, where they would say, well, we're just going to turn over the land, for example, one of the companies, we're going to turn over some of these lands to the states because the states are local and they're going to do a better job in managing it, as we mentioned earlier, because they know what's going on. And then what would happen is the states would find, in many cases, that it's to their advantage to sell the land, or they'll be under local political pressure, which can be applied much more easily at the local level to sell the lands to private industry. And so we would be disenfranchised of our birthright indirectly. In other words, none of these people that are advocating taking federal lands and redistributing them to the states ever says, oh, we're going to sell them off. But that would be the likely consequence.
So you would like to go a different direction. You would like to see the national parks expanded. Can you talk about, the reasons seem to me pretty obvious, but can you talk about them and talk about how and how, why and how?
Yes, there are several reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, the Park Service is philosophically more inclined to put ecosystem integrity and the health of wildlife and the landscapes ahead of other interests. Now, we can all complain that sometimes they capitulate to industrial tourism and other things. But in general, the people working for the National Park Service have a very strong preservation ethic. And so that's the first thing. Their initial reaction to anything isn't to figure out how to make a buck out of what's in a park. A second reason for expanding the parks is that a lot of our parks were, like Yellowstone is a good example, set aside a long time ago when we had much less understanding of the needs of wildlife, the needs of watersheds, ecosystem processes like wildfire and so forth. And if we could expand our parks, we could see an improvement in those things. For example, in Yellowstone, it's well established that there's insufficient winter range for a lot of the large ungulates like elk and bison and so forth. So they tend to migrate towards lower elevations, which are largely outside the boundaries of Yellowstone. And using bison as a good example, the state of Montana has decided that it doesn't want any wild bison in the state, and they try to kill them as soon as they cross the border into Montana. That has been alleviated slightly recently, but it wouldn't even be an issue if a lot of that lower elevation land were national park lands as opposed to national forest lands or private lands. So expansion of the parks would allow us to, particularly if it was done strategically, to encompass more complete ecosystems, and it would eliminate a lot of the conflicts that are ongoing as a result. Another reason for expanding the parks is that it would also ensure that some of our remaining, for example, old-growth forests, remaining wildlife habitat that could be jeopardized by commercial exploitation, whether it's logging or oil and gas drilling or whatever, is given protection into the future. So expansion of the parks is a good way to go, and it's frankly it's a lot easier to expand a park. Not to say that it's easy, but it is easier often than creating a new park. So identifying landscapes where parks could be expanded has more political likelihood of political success, I guess you could say, as a result.
Before we talk about how, can you talk a little bit about the importance of corridors? Can you talk about corridors and what, I mean, you sort of said it about the bison, but can you talk about that more explicitly, the importance of corridors to wildlife and to and how expanding national parks might help with their ability to migrate?
Yeah, sure. Anymore, so much of our landscape is fragmented by human uses, whether that's cities or highways or maybe more less intensive uses like livestock grazing or logging. But nevertheless, all those things fragment the easy movement of wildlife and the movement of plants too, by the way, from one area to another, and creating corridors where there's a safe passage, you might say, for those animals and plants can ensure that the populations won't grow so small that they will go locally extinct. And what happens over time is, species have a local population goes extinct and another population winks out, and eventually a species can go entirely extinct. And so but if you have some linkages between some of the better habitat, then even if a population momentarily or temporarily goes extinct locally, it can get recolonized again by that animal or plant, and so persist in the long term. So that's one of the reasons for corridors. And the other reason why you might want to think about corridors, it's a modern threat, but is the threat of climate change. And if climate change occurs to be as severe as predicted, a lot of plants and animals are going to have to move to find suitable habitat. And again, the larger the parks are, and so long as they're connected to other parks and other protected landscapes, there's a much better chance that these plants and animals will be able to move between them and survive in the face of changing climate.
This is one of the things, by the way, that I think makes the current mass extinction way worse than previous mass extinctions on the planet. That the previous mass extinctions, creatures were primarily faced with merely a quickly changing climate, as opposed to faced with a quickly changing climate and no corridors. I mean, 65 million years ago, the animals could still at least try to flee to the north, and they wouldn't have to worry about running into a city or an interstate.
Correct. Yes, and that's the extra burden we've put on wildlife and plant life today, is that we occupy so much of the landscape, or we've compromised the integrity of so much of the landscape that easy movement is made much more difficult. I was just in the Canadian Rockies. It's kind of an interesting side of one of the very small things to mitigate some of these problems. But on the Trans-Canadian Highway, which goes through Banff National Park, it's a major corridor across all of Canada, and all the traffic across the country goes on that highway. And what they have done is made overpasses for every few miles along this interstate that is covered with natural vegetation, and basically the cars go through tunnels. And there's fencing on either side of the highway to funnel wildlife to these overpasses, and they've documented that everything, grizzly bears, wolves, elk, moose, all sorts of wildlife use these overpasses now, and it helps them to be able to move back and forth across what would otherwise be a lethal barrier to them in many cases, that they would get hit by the ongoing traffic. And it's a small step, but it is the kind of thing that shows some concern for facilitating wildlife movement in the Canadian Rockies.
Before we started, I just remembered, before we started recording, you mentioned another threat to the Yellowstone area, and we talked for a moment about it being another benefit of expanding parks. Can you talk about the mines that are proposed at the edges of Yellowstone?
Yes, right now there's two mines, one like within 1 mile of Yellowstone, just to the north in Gardner, Montana, and then a second mine proposed, maybe 20 miles north of the park. And both mines would be permitted. They're on Forest Service land. Under the mining law of 1872, any individual or mining company can claim mineralized land on federal lands and basically privatize it. And they get it very cheap, $255 an acre. And it could be worth billions of dollars. But the way the mining law works, the public gets no royalties or any benefit from it. So it's a holdover from 1872. And so these are mineralized areas that have known gold. That's what the mines would be, gold mines. And the idea would be that they would, my understanding is it would be heap leach operations, which uses cyanide to remove the gold from the talus overburden and concentrate it. And of course, the danger is that this heap leach cyanide would pollute and get into the Yellowstone River and move downstream and kill a lot of the aquatic life in the Yellowstone River. Not to mention, also, any mining development brings new activity in these areas that are, for the most part, not seen. They're one is Innocent Gulch, where if the person walked up there once a week, there would be a lot of human traffic in that area. They replace that with trucks going back and forth all the time, and lots of explosions or whatever. It would certainly make that whole area less suitable for wildlife, which right now the area has grizzly bears in it, has wolves, it has elk, and bighorn sheep and so forth. So those animals would likely be displaced and or killed if these mines go forward.
So you mentioned something there that you said that there might be one human go up there every week, and that would be heavy traffic. That's actually, neither you nor I are human supremacists. So I'm throwing you a devil's advocate sort of thing that I fully don't believe. That what about the arguments, and the locals throw these out all the time when they're pushing for more roads in the local national forest. It's like, isn't it elitist and just all around horrible of you to suggest that humans not be allowed into that area? So what about people who are in wheelchairs? What about people who have emphysema, and so they can't actually hike? So those, you are prohibiting a huge number of people from experiencing the glories of nature by, why would you protect an area when there's only one person goes up a week? The area is going to waste. Once again, I feel my insides shrinking when I say this, but
I understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to, that you're presenting this idea that's often given, and my response to it, as probably yours would be, is a couple of things. One, we have already captured, so to speak, so much of the Earth's landscape for human uses as it is, including roads going all over the place. A spaghetti system of roads, even in a state like Montana, is probably 90% roaded, if not more so. I don't have the exact statistics, but anybody who wants to, is in a wheelchair and wants to see nature has incredible opportunities for that. There's no limit on access as it is. the other, and so by conversely, there's very few places for particularly wildlife that's sensitive, grizzly bears, wolves, or that are people have hostile attitudes towards, to find secure habitat. And part of that security is not having a lot of human activity in the area. So a trail that has one person a week is not likely to is likely to be used by, say, an animal like grizzly bears and not be disturbed by that use of one or two people a week. But if you were to funnel lots of cars or other people into that area, it would certainly displace, say, the grizzly bear. And they've already been displaced from huge areas and have very small portions of the American West for them to reside in. And these species, like grizzly bears, we use them because they're what we call umbrella species. In other words, if you protect the habitat for a wide-ranging animal like grizzly bear, you're protecting it for a lot smaller animals like squirrels and weasels and mice and so forth that most people wouldn't even be aware of. They get protection as long as the habitat for grizzly bears and wolves is intact, and those species have a safe harbor, so to speak.
So now at last, let's get to how would this be accomplished that the national parks get increased?
Well, one is I'm working with a friend of mine, Michael Kellett, who is the executive director of Restore the North Woods. And Restore the North Woods has been advocating a large national park in the Maine woods for about 25 years now. And Obama just designated the Katahdin Woods and Water National Monument, which would protect, under Park Service management, a portion of that area. But the other interest of Michael in particular is what we're calling the New National Parks movement. And we have identified numerous areas across the country that we feel would be better protected and in all sorts of ways if it were under national park management as opposed to other public agencies like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. And so one way to do that, I'll give you a good example. The White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire is already in many ways managed like a national park in the sense that there is logging there, there's some other activities that would never happen in a national park. But the main usage right now is basically human recreation, and then I would say, of course, protection of ecosystems. A lot of that area that's White Mountain National Forest was logged in the past and is slowly recovering and getting old growth characteristics, etc. But the Forest Service, which is the agency that manages it, keeps coming up with excuses for logging the White Mountain National Forest. And you may find this incredulous, but they use fire as one of the reasons. I mean, fire is almost non-existent in New England. Your typical fire rotation is once every 1,000 years, and yet we're still, like in the West, using the boogeyman of wildfire as a rationale for logging. So the White Mountain National Forest, which is about 2 hours from Boston, would be a good candidate to turn over to the National Park Service to manage and change the emphasis from resource exploitation to interpreting the landscape and protecting values like the recovery of old growth. So that's one way to get new national parks. And another way is to expand, as we mentioned earlier, existing parks that, for whatever reason, do not encompass a lot of the landscape that is necessary for free movement of wildlife. And a good example there of a landscape that could be expanded would be Olympic National Park. Olympic National Park has a coastal section, and then it has this gap about 20 miles between the coastal section strip and then sort of like the main part of the park that starts and includes some of the valleys with old-growth forests, like the Bogoshield Valley and the Hoh River Valley and some of those, the Queets River Valley. They're all famous for old-growth forests. But in between, there's state forest land, there's some private land, and so forth. That what would make it a much more complete and preservation package is if a lot of that land were acquired and then incorporated as part of Olympic National Park. So you had continuous Park Service management from the ocean all the way to the highest peaks. And so that would be an example of a park that could be expanded and improved as a result.
So for the most part, it sounds to me like you're saying, I mean, one of the concerns that would I can see being raised would be that the feds don't have the money. And I mean, let's not talk about the military budget or any of that. Let's just talk about the fact that the feds are operating at a deficit, and so the notion of actually purchasing new lands could be an easy target for the right wing to say that's why it can't happen. But if you're talking about merely administrative changes where you transfer land from the other land from the Forest Service or the BLM to the National Park Service, that doesn't actually involve an outlay of federal money to purchase lands, and there also doesn't have to be any land exchanges.
Exactly. So those are the ones that would be most successful. Although I would say that, there is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is constantly rated by Congress, but initially and originally was set aside where they took royalties from oil and gas leasing on federal lands and put it into this conservation fund to purchase park lands and other wildlife refuges, etc. And that fund could be in fact expanded, increased, and that would be one way of finding the money to do these acquisitions. And the other ways of funding acquisition would be, what I would say is that if you did a full accounting of all the ways that, for example, logging on national forest land loses money for the taxpayer, and some of it's easy to follow in the sense of, say, a lot of times timber on federal lands is sold at a loss to the taxpayer. But if you incorporate all the other costs that are never included in that timber sale, for example, sediment runs off a logging road and causes salmon to go extinct in the stream nearby, that's a cost. Or we spend money trying to recover salmon in that stream. And so the timber company isn't paying that cost. Society's paying it in general. So some of these things, if you were to do a real cost analysis, you would find that even acquiring that land or transferring it to the Park Service in the end would save taxpayers money and free up perhaps money that instead of spending it on building logging roads, we could spend it on acquiring land.
So I really like everything you're saying, and I'm going to throw out another opposition just because this pisses me off so much. I live in Del Norte County, and several years ago, a logging company wanted to donate, I don't remember, it was a fair amount of land to the national park, and it was facilitated through, like, Save the Redwood League or someone, and the land had been cut over and was growing back. It was on a fairly steep slope, and under current environmental regulations, it would never be allowed to be logged again. So the timber company wanted to get rid of it. They were paying taxes on it for no particular reason, or maybe somebody had a conscience, I don't know. But the point is that they were going to donate this to, or sell it for a reasonable price to Save the Redwoods, who would then donate it to the national park. And the locals, the local county board of supervisors, was freaking out, opposing this completely because this would lower the tax base. And the timber company said, fine, what I will do is I will pay, 50 or 100 years worth of taxes up front. I mean, so they got rid of that that obstacle anyway, and still the locals hated it just on general principle.
Right.
And I'm not even sure why I bring that up, but it was just a dreadful story of how this should be so easy, and it was just, in this case, the landowner didn't want it. They paid the taxes up front, and it was win-win for everybody, and still there were locals who opposed it because can't have them feds running more land.
Yeah, let me respond to two things that a lot of people don't realize in the story that you just told. One is people don't realize that taxes, generally by state legislatures and counties, on timber and agriculture and grazing, are incredibly low. That's probably why the timber company was willing to pay it for 50 years, because the amount that they had to pay is.
It was something. It was something that a normal human could have paid with trouble. You know, it's something that if it was less than a mortgage for 50 or 100 years worth of.
Right, exactly. It's often very reduced. The second thing that the county commissioners should know, but apparently don't know, is the federal government has a policy called payment in lieu of taxes, where the federal government pays percentage based on the value of the land that's under federal control in a county. They make payments to the counties, and that payment in lieu of taxes is often much higher than what the counties obtain from private landowners for exactly the same kind of land. In other words, I'll just make up a number. Let's say the timber companies pay $1 an acre taxes on the land. The federal government might pay $2 an acre. And so they actually do better with federal ownership. And the federal government, for better or for worse, does other things that the county doesn't have to pay for, like firefighting, like maintaining all the roads out there that are on the federal lands that people drive, that the county doesn't have to pay for, and so forth. So there's a lot of economic benefits, actually, to federal ownership that these rural county commissioners and rural residents don't understand. I remember, I'm going to give one story, but when I was living in Livingston, Montana, the Forest Service acquired 35,000 acres or something like that from a wealthy rancher. And the county commissioners put up a big stink about how that was going to affect the tax base, until it was found out that under the PILT payments, under the standard procedure of PILT payments, the federal government would pay 8 times what the rancher had been paying in taxes to the county. And that's because, and it's not because PILT payments are so large, it's just that taxes on ranch land and timberland are so low.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and what is your I guess my first wind-up question is, so if they made you the person who was in charge of the distribution of land between the national parks and the BLM, etc., what would be some of your first steps?
Well, I would try to look at things from a landscape scale perspective, addressing some of the issues we mentioned earlier, like protecting wildlife corridors, protecting lower elevation lands that might be either important because it has old growth forests or it's important wildlife habitat. I would try to identify lands that would provide linkages. In other words, maybe one area is separated by another area, 10 miles away or 20 miles away. You effectively protect both areas better than if it was just isolated one. So I would look at that kind of, looking at it from a conservation planning perspective. I would look for important kinds of habitat and ecosystems to protect that are either rare or very important productive lands. Wetlands, places that river corridors, rare soil sites, etc. And put all this into a mix and see what comes up as a high priority. And then what I might do as an additional step is look at which of these areas have the greatest threats against them. So that would help prioritize. Okay, we've got all these lands out there you've already identified as being ecologically important, but some are probably going to be changed much more rapidly in the future because of some perceived threats than others. So those would be the prioritized lands to try to protect those parks.
So everything you're saying makes perfect sense, and I think it's a good direction to go. And this seems a little bit different than a specific campaign to stop a wolf pack from being slaughtered, or some other fairly specific campaign, or a campaign to save monarch butterflies even, in that this seems really large scale. And so what can people do? What do you want people to do to try to help with people who agree with everything you're saying? What can they do to help raise the awareness of this possibility and to help advocate for this?
Well, since all this is ultimately politics, it would be trying to help elect people who are more sympathetic to the idea of protecting the landscape. So that would be an important step. And the second would be to try to educate people, whether that's educate themselves so they can articulate these reasons well, or if they feel like they already have a grasp of why it's important to do this, then try to educate other people about it, because that's what it's going to take is trying to get a lot of buy-in from quite a number of people that this is an important enough goal. And the other part, which alludes to some of the things you said earlier, that it's an achievable goal. I believe it is. The obstacles that you've mentioned, they're real, but they're not obstacles that can't be overcome, particularly with education. So I see advocacy and education as critical.
And it seems important, if you wouldn't mind repeating Brock Evans' famous phrase, it seems that this might be an appropriate time for that.
Endless pressure, endlessly applied.
Well, I think that's great, and I want to thank you for your decades now of endlessly applying pressure. I mean, you are one of my heroes, and I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been George Wuerthner. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. Ooh.